Without me, you'd be sleeping in your car." My father-in-law said it loud enough for the whole boardroom to hear, leaning back in his chair like he owned the air in the room. The lawyer beside him smirked. The accountant across the table didn't even look up from his folder. I sat there in my gray blazer, hands folded on the table, and let him finish. "She married into this family with nothing, you understand, nothing. And now she thinks she can sit at this table and tell us how to run a company that's been in our family for 60 years. Our family lawyer, the one my husband had hired specifically for this meeting, cleared his throat and slid a single sheet of paper across the table. My father-in-law looked down at it, confused. Then he looked up. "What is this?" "That's the registration for Halden Capital Partners," the lawyer said quietly. "The firm that holds 83% of the outstanding shares in Whitfield Logistics. Your company, Mr. Whitfield." My father-in-law's face went the color of old paper. "That's impossible. Halden is a numbered company out of Toronto. It's mine," I said. It was the first thing I'd said in 40 minutes. My name doesn't matter as much as what they called me for 6 years, which was Marcus's wife, said the way some people say the help. I'm 38. I grew up in a rented townhouse in Scarborough with a single mom who cleaned offices at night, and somehow still made it to every one of my hockey games. I put myself through Western on scholarships and student loans I didn't finish paying off until I was 31. I met Marcus Whitfield at a fundraiser I was working, not attending. I was there managing investor relations for the charity, making sure the right people stood next to the right other people for photos. He spilled red wine on my dress and apologized so genuinely, so without the practiced charm I'd come to expect from men in rooms like that I gave him my number before I gave myself permission to. His family did not approve, not loudly, not at first. The Whitfields were old Ontario money, 3 generations deep in shipping and logistics, the kind of family that had a wing named after them at a hospital in Kingston. His father, Graham Whitfield, built Whitfield Logistics from 2 trucks into a national freight company, and he ran his family the same way he ran his board meetings. Total control, zero patience for anyone he hadn't personally vetted. His mother, Patricia, was warmer in public and colder in private, the kind of woman who complimented your shoes and then mentioned, almost as an aside, that she hoped you weren't planning on having children right away because Marcus had such important work ahead of him. I learned to live in the spaces they left for me. I went to the Christmas parties. I sat quietly at the Sunday dinners in their house on the lake in Muskoka, the one with the boathouse bigger than the home I grew up in. I smiled when Graham introduced me to business associates as Marcus' wife. "She's in finance, isn't that nice?" Never my name, never what I actually did, which was run a quietly successful investment advisory practice I'd built from nothing starting the year after we got married. Back when I still had something to prove to people who would never bother to ask. It was Patricia who said it first, at a dinner 2 years into the marriage. We were celebrating Marcus's birthday and I'd had 2 glasses of wine and made the mistake of correcting Graham on a point about interest rate forecasting. Gently, I thought, the way you'd correct anyone in a normal conversation. The table went quiet. Patricia set down her fork and said, "Sweetheart, I think Graham's been doing this a little longer than you've had your little business." Little business. The business that by that point was managing close to $40 million in client assets. I didn't correct her. I learned that night that being right wasn't the same as being heard, not in that house, not with that family. So I stopped trying to be heard there. I built somewhere else instead. Marcus, to his credit, fought with his father more than I ever asked him to. He'd come home from Sunday dinners furious on my behalf, pacing our kitchen in Yorkville, saying things like he has no right to talk to you like that, and I'm done bringing you there if he can't be civil. But Marcus also worked for his father. Marcus's entire career, his salary, his title as VP of Operations, his eventual inheritance of a company that employed 4,000 people across Canada, all of it ran through Graham Whitfield. So the fighting always ended the same way. An apology that wasn't really an apology. A long silence at the next family gathering, and then everyone pretending it hadn't happened, because pretending was the family business as much as freight was. The accident happened on a Tuesday in November, the kind of gray, wet Toronto Tuesday that makes the whole city feel like it's holding its breath. Marcus was driving back from a site visit at one of the Hamilton warehouses when a transport truck, not even one of his own company's trucks, just bitter irony, lost control on the wet 403 and hit him head-on. I got the call at 4:47 in the afternoon. I remember the exact time because I was looking at my phone when it rang, checking a message from a client, and then the world just stopped making sense for a while. He survived. I need to say that clearly because I know how these stories usually go, and this isn't that kind of story. Marcus survived, but barely, and the 11 days he spent in the ICU at Sunnybrook are 11 days I don't fully remember in order anymore. What I remember is the waiting room. I remember Graham showing up 4 hours after I called him in a suit, asking the nurses questions about Marcus's condition like he was conducting a board meeting. Like efficiency somehow will his son back to consciousness faster. I remember Patricia crying beautifully into a handkerchief that matched her coat, and I remember neither of them asking me how I was doing. Not once, in 11 days, as if my fear for my husband somehow mattered less than theirs because my last name wasn't Whitfield. Marcus woke up. He had a long road of physiotherapy ahead of him, a titanium rod in his left leg, and a traumatic brain injury that the doctors said could affect his memory, his mood, his executive function. They used the word unpredictable a lot. In that careful clinical way doctors have of preparing you for the worst without quite saying it. What they didn't prepare me for was Graham's reaction once the immediate danger had passed and the fear curdled into something else. I was in the hospital cafeteria 3 days after Marcus woke up, getting coffee I wasn't going to drink when Graham found me. He sat down across from me without asking, which was very on brand for him, and folded his hands on the table. "I want to talk about Marcus's role at the company," he said. I told him this didn't seem like the time, that Marcus had just opened his eyes 3 days ago, that surely operations could wait. "It can't," Graham said. "And frankly, I think it's time we talked about yours too." I asked him what he meant. "I mean," he said, choosing his words the way he chose everything deliberately, like a man laying bricks, "that Marcus is not going to be capable of running this company anymore, not the way the doctors are describing it. And I need to start thinking about succession seriously, which means I need to think about whether you're going to be a part of this family's future, or whether it's time for some honesty." I asked him, very calmly, if he was suggesting I leave my husband while he was still in a hospital bed. "I'm suggesting," he said, "that you think very seriously about what you actually bring to this family. You didn't grow up in this world. You don't understand how a company like this runs, the relationships, the legacy. Marcus is going to need someone who can support him completely now, financially and otherwise, and frankly, sweetheart, I don't know what you'd be supporting him with. Your little advisory firm? That's sweet. It's not Whitfield Logistics. I want to tell you I had a perfect cutting response in that moment, something out of a movie. I didn't. I just stood up, left my untouched coffee on the table, and went back upstairs to sit with my husband, because that's what you do when someone you love is hurt, and someone else is trying to make you feel small in the same week. You choose where to spend your strength. But I didn't forget it. I want to be honest about that part too. I'm not a saint in this story, and I don't think you should have to be one to deserve respect. Something in me went very cold and very clear that day in the cafeteria. Not angry, not yet. Clear. Like I'd been looking at my marriage and my place in that family through frosted glass for 6 years, and Graham had just wiped a small section of it clean, and what I saw on the other side was simple. I would never ever be enough for these people, no matter what I built. Because what I built wasn't the right kind of building. So I went home and I started building something they wouldn't see coming. Here's what Graham Whitfield never bothered to learn about me in 6 years of family dinners. My little advisory firm had grown a quiet, very specific specialty over the past decade: distressed logistics and shipping assets. I understood freight margins, fuel hedging, fleet depreciation, union contract liabilities, all the unglamorous machinery that makes a transport company either wildly profitable or one bad quarter from collapse, because I'd spent 10 years advising exactly that kind of company through exactly those problems. It wasn't a coincidence that I knew this world so well. I'd chosen it years ago, specifically because it was Marcus's world too, and some part of me, the part that grew up watching my mother get talked down to by people who had more money and less character, had wanted to understand the ground he stood on better than anyone in his family ever would. Whitfield Logistics was a strong company with one persistent, quiet problem: it was over-leveraged. Graham had expanded aggressively in the early 2010s, taking on debt to acquire smaller regional carriers across Quebec and the Maritimes. And while the company looked formidable on the outside, the trucks, the warehouses, the name on the side of every fourth highway trailer in Ontario, the actual ownership structure was thinner than people assumed. A significant portion of the company's shares had been used as collateral for an expansion loan years earlier, structured through a numbered holding company, so that family and competitors alike wouldn't see how much control Graham had quietly leveraged away. I knew this because I'd had a client, years before I ever met Marcus, who'd considered acquiring that very debt position and walked away from it, calling it interesting but too tangled. I never forgot how tangled. I spent the next 4 months, while Marcus was relearning how to walk a straight hallway and rebuild his short-term memory one flashcard at a time, quietly acquiring that debt position through Halden Capital Partners, a numbered company I'd registered in Toronto 8 years earlier for exactly this kind of work. Patient, unglamorous, unsexy acquisitions that nobody in a room like the Whitfield family dining room would ever think to ask a daughter-in-law about, because why would they? I wasn't hiding it out of some grand revenge fantasy. I want to be honest about that too. I was hiding it because it was simply standard practice in my business, the same way I'd handled 40 other deals before it. It just happened this time to be the deal that mattered most. By the time Graham called the emergency board meeting, the one Patricia had been pushing him toward for weeks, the one meant to formally restructure Marcus out of any future leadership role, and, I'd later learn, to quietly explore whether the family's lawyers could structure some kind of separation that would minimize what I'd be entitled to if Marcus and I divorced. A contingency Graham apparently felt was worth planning for before my husband had even regained his full speech. Halden Capital Partners held 83% of the company's voting shares. Not because of anything dramatic, because the debt I'd acquired came with conversion rights that, when exercised, gave the holder controlling equity. I had simply been the only person at that family's table who understood, the whole time, exactly what the ground actually looked like underneath them. Marcus knew. I want to say that clearly because I never wanted this to be a story about deceiving my husband. I told him everything, sitting in his hospital room during week 6, when his memory had started knitting itself back together, and the doctor said he was strong enough for real conversations. He laughed, a real laugh, the first one I'd heard from him since the accident, and said, "Of course you did. Of course you spent 4 months quietly buying my family's company instead of falling apart." Then he got quiet and said the thing that actually mattered to me more than any of it. "He talked to you like that in a hospital cafeteria while I was still in a coma. I need you to know I believe you. I need you to know I'm not going to pretend that didn't happen, the way this family pretends everything difficult didn't happen." The board meeting was in the same boardroom on the 40th floor of the building on Bay Street, where I'd sat through 11 mind-numbing strategy sessions over the years, always introduced, never truly seen. Graham opened by addressing Marcus's situation with the same careful, deliberate cruelty he'd used on me in that cafeteria, talking about his son's cognitive recovery in the detached language of a man discussing a depreciating asset rather than his own child. Patricia sat beside him, dabbing at dry eyes. And then he turned to me, the wife who'd shown up uninvited to represent Marcus's interests, he said, with a small, indulgent smile, like I was a child who'd wandered into an adult meeting. "Without me," he said, to me, but loud enough for the room, the same performance he'd give me later in a different meeting, the one I started this story with, "this family would have nothing. Whitfield Logistics exists because I built it with my own hands, while the rest of you enjoyed what I made. I think it's time we discussed who actually belongs at this table." That's when our lawyer slid the paper across to him. I won't pretend the moment didn't feel good. Watching the color drain out of Graham Whitfield's face while he read the words Halden Capital Partners, 83% of outstanding voting shares, was, if I'm honest, one of the most satisfying moments of my adult life, and I don't think I owe anyone an apology for that. But what I remember more clearly than his shock was Patricia's voice, very small, asking, "How long?" And the way Graham looked at me, not with fear exactly, but with something I'd never seen from him before, which was the dawning, humiliating realization that he had spent 6 years underestimating the one person in that family who'd been quietly capable of dismantling everything he'd built, and had chosen every single time not to. I didn't dismantle it. I want to say that because I know some people watching this might want a story where I burn the company to the ground and walk away with the ashes. That was never the point. I restructured the board. I kept the 4,000 employees, the drivers and warehouse staff and dispatchers who had nothing to do with Graham's cruelty and everything to do with the company actually functioning. I installed an independent operations committee that doesn't answer to family politics. I gave Marcus a real role this time, not the symbolic VP title his father dangled in front of him for 15 years, but actual decision-making authority backed by a voting trust we set up together, one that protects him even from me, if it ever came to that, because that's what real partnership looks like. Graham still sits on the board, technically. He has 1 vote out of 7 now, and he has, for the first time in his life, had to learn what it feels like to be the person in the room whose opinion is heard but not automatically obeyed. Patricia and I have not spoken since the meeting, and I don't think we will, and I've made my peace with that in a way that surprised me. Grief for a relationship that was never really a relationship, just a performance of one I'd been auditioning for since the day I met Marcus. We had our first Christmas without the lake house gatherings last year. Marcus and I hosted instead in our own home, with my mother at the head of the table for the first time in 6 years, telling stories from when Marcus was learning to walk again, and what good company we actually kept came down, in the end, not to whose name was on a building in Kingston, but to who showed up for you in a hospital cafeteria when nobody was watching, and who didn't.